right, we should be live here in a couple of seconds. Buffering, doing its thing.
Live on Facebook is what my screen says.
Yep. Here we go. All right, we are live, sir. How are you tonight?
Doing great, Ray. How are you?
Great, I am well. It's been a long time coming since you and I have had the chance to get together. I'm hosting Greg Garret tonight. It's not Monday night. Normally on Monday night, I do something called Monday's Meal, but today is Thursday, but it's still a good day to provide manna for those who want to be pushed and moved toward their mandate. An interesting time and thing is happening in our country right now, as you well know, with the death of the current gentleman, George Floyd, who lost his life there in Minneapolis and Minnesota. We've also had Ahmaud Arbery, who has passed away as well, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor. I mean, I could continue to go on. Tonight, we're going to have a very candid conversation about race in America, and something that needs to be had and needs to take place all over the United States of America. And so I want to get started tonight by simply showing a video, Greg, and give our audience that's watching us, as soon as you see this, I want you to share this with a friend, get as many people in as you can, start a watch party. Many people are concerned about what are we going to do next. And some parts of the country, in terms of the population, are people who are asleep right now and aren't necessarily conscious to what's happening. And so I'm going to take a few moments. I want to share that and kind of get started with that first tonight to give people a chance to come in. And then you and I will get started right in a conversation on tonight and spend some time together. Let's start this way.
Wake up, wake up. You've got the power. You've got my people in the east, yo, you gotta wake up. Midwest, dirty South, yo, you gotta stand up. All my homies in the west, yo, you gotta wake up. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. Wake up, wake up. Wake up, everybody, no more sleeping in bed. No more backwards thinking, time for thinking ahead. The world has changed so very much from what it used to be. There's so much hatred, war and poverty. Wake up, our teachers, time to teach a new way. Maybe then they'll listen to what you have to say. 'Cause they're the one who's coming up. The world is in their hands. When you teach the children, teach them the best to. Bring peace, do we mean it? Can you feel it when we scream it out loud? Do you believe that we need it? Do you believe that it could get right? Do you believe that the children of the world deserve a good life? Well, if you do, it's time to wake up your mind. We can make it better, and I know it might take some time, but we gotta start somewhere. How about with you and me? From us it goes to others, then we'll have our unity. All the doctors make the old people well. They're the ones who suffer, who catch all the hell. But they don't have so very long before that judgment day. So won't you make them happy before they pass away? Wake up, all the builders, time to build a new land. I know we can do it, long as we lend a hand. The only thing we have to do is put it in our blood, and surely things will work out, 'cause they do it.
I ain't here to take up y'all time. I came to shake up y'all mind. It's everybody's wake up call time. I can't sleep too long. Why they do the people wrong? Let's clean the world up before they sweep you gone. This is real talk. You can peep through songs. So when you feel weak, these words will keep you strong and help make a change for the better. It's hard for one to do it, but we can make some changes together.
We gotta change it, yeah. Won't get no better. Let it be, let it be, let it be.
stand up here and give thanks to the man upstairs. Put the egos and the pride to the side regardless, and just be role models, parents, artists. We can make it change or we can make it the hardest. If you gonna make a baby, you should make them the smartest. Let them know good and bad, right from wrong, how to roll with the punches when life moves on. And the stress won't take toll if you don't sweat it. World won't get no better if we don't let it. Let the negative energy ride, keep hope alive. It's about time that we open our eyes. Wake up.
Everybody, no more sleeping in bed. No more backward thinking, time for thinking ahead. The world has changed so very much from what it used to be. There's so much hatred, war and poverty. Wake up, 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 wake up.
Yeah, well, y'all best to vote. I don't care about the guns you tote. Listen to me like you listen to Fahrenheit 9/11. Ain't no time for the second guess. The words I speak, the ones who sleep, the leadership's fix your mouth to teach. MCs teach the kids with peace. They don't have to worry about the police. We make them rich so they don't have to thief. Every artist here on this track. We'll make a change here for young cats. This is for everybody, white or black. You better go and vote and get up off your back. This life of rolls on, lift your head, get your voice up. You see the power of the people, it's a choice to ignite love. Now the choice is a gift that our people have to fight for. And the price far too personal for anyone to ignore. A voice to be heard. Take the opportunity. The responsibility. Your voice has to be heard. Save the world, save the
Wow, absolutely powerful. Absolutely powerful. I don't know about you, but I graduated, from one of the best high schools in Hampton. I'm sure that you would beg to differ with me. I've graduated from Bethel. I know you, superstar over there at Hampton High School. So
That was a high school and not a junior high? Is that?
you sound like my friend Gerard Ruff right about now. My other one, Kevin Swan.
Oh, but Gerard Ruff, the problem with Gerard Ruff is he went to Kickingham.
Right.
I don't even think they had a football team, did they? Hey, Hampton have football teams. We know that.
You know good and well that's going to make him want to have access into the Zoom room for that right there.
He can't get in. He's got to keep it later.
Yeah, you got to keep it later. But listen, man, in the year I graduated, there was a song called You're Headed from Self-Destruction. 25 artists got together, did the same thing. And it's hard to believe, Greg, but some people are asleep in America right now. They're not necessarily conscious of what's going on or what's taking place in the nation. And for many, they don't understand why so many African Americans are upset and angry at this most recent tragedy that has taken place with George Floyd. And on the one hand, that's one issue. On the other, many are saying, why has it taken this long for America to become conscious? America is asleep, and many blacks have asserted to the idea of white privilege. And I'm sure, just as you know, I know as well, many of are those who are our friends, associates, those who are married into our families as African Americans, and many others are just kind of going, what in the world, how in the world do you not understand white privilege? And so your history speaks for itself in terms of how you have served here in Hampton Roads and in the community in terms of your mentorship, your missionary work overseas, but your inner city work here within Hampton, Newport News, Norfolk speaks for itself. Could you speak to both audiences tonight for people who may not understand what white privilege is and give an example of how white privilege applies and in this kind of a scenario or situation? And then we're going to talk a little bit more about how we got here. But just give us, an understanding, someone who's Caucasian, who's white.
And let me back up for a minute before I talk about my story, and that is I have been pretty vocal over the last few years and very vocal, especially over the last couple of weeks, intently vocal about racism, inequality, and issues that we really need to fix. My feeling is that it's important that we confront people that in our own that look like us, people confront people in our own race that look like us, and at the same time love and try to understand people that don't look like us.
Mm-hmm.
What we've all seen is confronting people that don't look like us doesn't solve anything. As long as we think the other group needs to fix the problem, and we don't, then that's going to create a whole new set of problems. Mm-hmm. And so I have been speaking to publicly and on social media, on my Facebook page, to largely a white audience, and not that I don't know the mix of people on my page. It might be 50-50. I'm not sure, but in terms of the issues that I'm confronting are issues that have made a tremendous amount of Caucasians upset. Mm-hmm. And I really believe that there is still hate among some Caucasians. I believe that is a very small percentage of the Caucasians that actually really overtly hate and know that they hate. But there is a real sense among many Caucasians that why do we keep talking about racism? There isn't racism. I had a guy that I went to high school with, a white gentleman that I went to high school with. He graduated 2 years before I did. Mm-hmm. And he said he wasn't going to join this call tonight. He wasn't going to participate tonight because there is no racism in America, period. There isn't. And that was his position. And I'm assuming that he is sincere in that belief. I believe that he's sincerely wrong, but I absolutely give him credit for being sincere. I don't believe that he would publicly go on my page and say that there is no racism if he really thought that there was. And so there's a blindness. And so in my prayer life, I say, Lord, remove my blind spots, reveal my blind spots to me. And so as we try to do that, we get an insight into where we cannot see something in the past, where we have not present been able to see something and understand something from somebody else's perspective. And so that's what I'm attempting to do. And I tell you, when I came out a week ago and said I agreed with the governor that he should take down the statue of Robert E. Lee, who happens to be my cousin. When I said that, man, I have made some white people mad on that one.
Wait a minute, Greg. Wait a minute. You have said something that our listening audience, I'm sure, has never heard of before. You said, number one, you agreed with Governor Northam that the statue of Robert E. Lee, which is a part of history in America and Confederate history, should come down.
Yes.
And then you said something a little bit more personal. You said that Robert E. Lee is your cousin and that you're a distant relative to Robert E. Lee. Did I hear you say that right?
Right.
And
I'm an ancestor. I'm a descendant of a gentleman that came over here in 1620, the year after the first Africans came here as slaves in 16. And so we've been here a long time. And Robert E. Lee is a cousin. But that doesn't mean anything. It's in terms of my belief about that statue. That statue for African Americans, that statue represents a man that led the army to fight for the Southern states' rights. That first and foremost, at least in the belief of the African American community. I wasn't there. I don't know why they were fighting, but the belief is today among many people in the United States, especially African Americans, that the primary reason for that fight was to keep slavery alive so that white people could own black people, as my ancestors did. I had ancestors that owned slaves, and they fought for the right to continue that. And it was economic catastrophe for some members of my family when that was abolished, which it should have been abolished. It was catastrophe.
Greg, it is so refreshing that in 2020, it's a shame that it's taken this long But for someone like yourself who has roots all the way back to the American founding, the establishment of the nation, and then to not only have that, but connections to the establishment of our Commonwealth, in which Virginia is a seedbed for slavery, the Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, and to be connected to that, but be able to say that that is wrong, that owning other people and having dominance over their future in terms of their mobility, their access to the pursuit of happiness and owning property, and their ability to be able to sojourn wherever they would like to go, choosing their professions, that is wrong. And so many people don't necessarily make the connection between that. Many white people do not make the connection between the Confederacy, slavery, and the right to pursue their happiness came from the standpoint of the free labor that happened at the hands of African Americans. What are you saying to them right now in terms of this is a moral outrage that this happened and the statute should go? One, how are they responding to?
Well, I mean, I don't know of any white people that says we should still have slavery, right? But there's no correlation to what slavery did to dwarf the potential growth of the African Americans here in our country, not even being recognized as human beings, right? I mean, George Washington is also a cousin of mine. Look at what those men and women had. I have a book about my ancestry, and it has interesting things in it. And one of the things that one of my great grandmothers bragged about, it's in this ancestry book, is that none of her children were ever going to learn to tie their shoes. This is horrible. They were never going to learn to tie their shoes because Black people that they owned were there to tie their shoes. They were never going to learn to tie their shoes. It's just, it's catastrophic. And when we talk about blind spots, we can go back and see the blind spots of slavery. We can go back and see the blind spots of that was horrible. White people shouldn't have owned Black people. We shouldn't have had them in slave ships. We shouldn't have had them in shackles. We shouldn't have whipped them. We didn't do it, not the we of today, but white people of yesterday. The white people should not have done that. Our great grandfathers and grandmothers should not have done. We can see that. But what we cannot see is the blindness of today. We cannot see the blind spots of today. I have a hard time seeing mine. You have a hard time seeing yours. And there's the sense that the Confederate flag or statues of Confederate heroes don't represent racism is blindness. It is blindness. If we can put ourselves in the shoes of our African American brothers and sisters, and we drive down the Monument Avenue, a incredible historic street in Richmond, Virginia, or we drive down Newport News up in Courthouse Green, or we go down to downtown Norfolk on Main Street, downtown Norfolk, we have a statue to honor Confederate soldiers. If we see, how can we not see that as white people, all white people? There's a lot of white people that do see it, more and more every day see it. But why can we not see that and recognize this is hurtful? This is not going to bring the unity, the love, the harmony that we need to have as a community.
Well, which takes me right into something else. I want to share my screen with you again one more time, and I want to get a good glimpse, if you will, at the Virginia Bill of Rights. And I want to show our listening audience on the screen here exactly what the Virginia Bill of Rights seems to suggest and say to us. Now I'm going to pull this up real quickly. And it'll start. Go ahead.
Before you do it, let me just make sure I clarify my position.
Sure.
I'm not for vandalizing the statues.
Yes.
I'm not for destroying them. I'm not for tearing them down. They are an important part of our history, a sad part of our history in a way, but they're an important part of our history. And there are a lot of people that really believe that all those heroes and men were doing was fighting for states' rights. They believe that all that they were fighting to defend their property rights, those kinds of things. I am totally, I'm for removing them from the public square and putting them in places where people can go and see them. If somebody wants to go see them and say these were were good men or bad men, or they did the right thing or they did the wrong, whatever they want to, that's between them and their God. It's between them and their families. But I'm not for destroying them. I'm not for loading them up with graffiti. I am for removing them and putting them in a place where people can go see them and put them in whatever perspective they want to see them.
Mm-hmm. So not necessarily having them in the seat of the public square of our governments throughout the states,
where anybody has to see them, not in a place on a main street, not on the street, not in a public place, but put in a place where if somebody wants to take care of them and see them or set up a museum for them, not with public funds, in my opinion, it shouldn't even be public funds to do that.
So let there be private funds for them. Now, I can tell you most African Americans want to see them completely and utterly destroyed, because states' rights really means, in terms of the translated history that we've seen throughout time, is the right to property ownership. We are viewed as 3/5 of a man constitutionally and didn't necessarily get citizenship rights until 1964. So therein lies the correlation. But now the important part about this for us as believers, and we haven't brought in what I call Christianity, not Christianity, because there's a difference between the Americanized view of Scripture and then the authentic, literal understanding of the Scripture. I want to show something here in terms of the founding of America. Now, it's going to show my Facebook page here, but I'm going to remove that in just a second, and I'm going to pull up here, I believe, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and I believe what that will do is give us a good glimpse of an understanding of what we mean when we say Christian forbearance. Can you see that there? And I believe our onlooking audience can see it as well. This is the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which became the Bill of Rights constitutionally to the United States. I want to scroll all the way down to the different sections, and I want to go to Article 15. Now, they've changed it up a little bit somewhat today, but here is what it says. It was actually Article 16. Well, I can read 15 as well so that everyone can see it. It says that no free government or the blessing of liberty can be preserved to any people by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue, by frequent recurrence to fundamental principles, okay? It can only be preserved by an adherence to these principles. Then they added 16. Look at what 16 has to say. That religion or the duty which we owe our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction. Now, we know that's freedom of religion, not by force or violence. Many would say slaves were Christianized by force. Therefore, all men are equally entitled, here it is, Greg, to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. Here it is. And that is the mutual duty of all to practice, the mutual duty of all, every citizen, every person, the entire population, to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity toward each other. And the idea of slavery and owning another person, that ain't too Christian.
No.
So when you're speaking tonight that this is something that is completely and totally off the idea of slavery and that it is wrong, that comes out of the heart of Christianity in its purest sense and in its purest form. And I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but we're going to come back to it and touch on it in a minute. But if our nation's going to heal, it's just like when we come to Christ. When we come to him, we must acknowledge our sin. There's got to be a moment that says, God, I'm wrong. I've missed it. I need forgiveness. Help me to be able, and to your point, to see differently, to see life from your perspective and not mine. Right. So the Southern slave owners were seeing life from their perspective, and not necessarily from the perspective of Scripture's prism. Now, we'll come into that in a few more moments, which is why I believe still today that when you get a head start in the area of economic mobility, political freedom, access to open markets, the opportunity, all of it. So
land ownership.
Yes, land ownership, all of it. I want, if you could, we were talking and having lunch the other day, And people don't know that we really do know each other. We may not talk every day, but we're not strangers to each other. That's what
many years.
many years. What people may not, when you begin to say, you know, Ray, I had an experience where I pulled into a parking lot, and then I'll let you pick it up from right there.
Well, I tell you, I want to touch on something that you said about, we're back still kind of on the idea of blind spots and what was happening back then.
Sure.
Okay, so I have, in this book about my ancestry, there is a will in that book.
Mm-hmm.
And in that will, one of my great-great-great-grandfathers gave in his will dozens of slaves.
Wow.
20 to his wife, and to each child he gave 18 slaves.
Do that one more time.
To each child he gave my great-great-grandfather gave 18 slaves. And to his wife he gave 20. And here is the commentary written about my great-great-grandfather. So my mother's mother, my grandmother, was born a Motley.
Mm-hmm.
A Motley. And this is my great-great-grandfather, great-great-great, I don't know how many greats, I can figure it up, but it doesn't matter, so many greats. Joseph Motley, who died somewhere around 1850.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what it said, and this is indicative of, this is the point is the blindness in this commentary about my great-great-grandfather, because there are 4 words to describe my great-great-great-grandfather. The words are success, considerate, fair, and affectionate. So my great-great-great-grandfather, successful, affectionate, considerate, and fair. And the demonstration of his fairness, the demonstration of his affection, the demonstration of his considerateness, if that's the word. It says the listing above. Now the listing above that it's talking about is where he gave people that he owned to his wife and his children upon his death. The listing above indicates that Joseph Motley was a successful businessman. His gifts of land and slaves to each of his children when they were married, as well as the distribution of his estate by will, show him to be, that's the evidence of, it says, show him to be an affectionate, fair, and considerate father and husband.
My God.
That's the sin that I've inherited. I've been born from his loins, and 4 or 5 generations, whatever it is ago.
Right.
And so I'm just saying that what we can see that we can see how could that be demonstrated as the evidence of his fairness, right? But again, it's the same thing today. How can we not realize that what we're doing is part of the problem? How can we not realize that what we're thinking is part of the problem? How can we not realize that there's probably something wrong with us, and there's probably some unfairness in us, some lack of affection in us, some lack of being considerate towards others inside of us? How can we not see that? And
so while you open the door for me to move to this next area, we'll come back to white privilege again. When you start to think about, as a theologian and a scholar, and in terms of my research work, dissertation wise here within the Commonwealth of Virginia, there are several people who helped to create the idea of what you just mentioned, fairness, considerate, because African Americans at that time were not viewed as human. They were viewed as a commodity, a widget, if you will, that would fit on an assembly line to produce the production of goods and services. So the question becomes,
human plows, human tractors.
Yeah. So now, if this, we espouse to the idea that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal with their indelible rights, okay? So when we begin to have that thought process constitutionally, but we deny a segment of the humanity of those who should be engrafted into that, the propagation of that comes from somewhere. And I want to share my screen with you again for the listening audience, for people who may not necessarily be as knowledgeable or aware, because, you know, Greg, you and I, as we talk about this all the time, you know, the subtitle for us was, as Virginia goes, so goes the nation.
Right.
And so Virginia being the seedbed of this, I want you to take a look at John Early right here. I've got John Early up on the screen. He was a Methodist bishop, but John Early, he's founded, as you can see there, Randolph-Macon College. But the interesting thing about John Early that people may not know is that he was not only a consecrated bishop, but look here, during the American Civil War, Bishop Early supported the Confederacy and associated with the Holston Conference from 1862 to 1865, based in Lynchburg. He led the conference in the expulsion of pro-Union itinerant ministers during the Civil War. He had a heavy influence on Francis Asbury, who originally fought to abolish slavery, but John Early, once he got a hold of him, he began to write works like this: A Man of Faith and Works, Methodism in the South, Stray Leaves from Tennessee History. He gives a clear defense through a Christian lens of how to defend the idea of slavery among those new Methodist Christians here in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. And the reason I mentioned that is because at the Constitutional Convention, Reconstruction's getting ready to happen and taking place. Fred Douglass is arguing to abolish slavery. It is anti-Christian. It dehumanizes people. Asbury is there after he has heard from the bishop here in Virginia. Asbury's in this debate back and forth. You and I know the scripture to say, whom the Son has set free is free indeed. All of a sudden, Asbury flip-flops, and he begins to argue and begins to say, well, as it pertains to the soul of the slave, we'll leave that in the hands of God. But his body, we'll put that in the hands of the state. And thus Reconstruction takes place, and an entire movement, John Wesley's Methodist movement, now is imputed with the vestiges of slavery from such a strong vitriol place to protect the rights of Southern slave owners who claim to be Christians. This is how this has happened. And I've got another one. I won't show that screen right now, I'll show it later, but I'll just mention Thomas Dew, president from William and Mary, helped to construct, at that time, it was called the Virginia House of Burgess, and helped to construct a lot of what we know today as case law that would come from Virginia. A devout proponent of making sure slavery stayed in place, former president from William and Mary. So it's ingrained in the psyche, in the consciousness, in the culture of America, particularly where whites are concerned. So when you understand that backdrop, not that I'm making any kind of justification for it because it's just clearly wrong, but when you've got that backdrop, now you can understand, at least to some degree, while people are totally oblivious, like your ancestor, considerate, kind, generous, fair. Well, according to who, by what standard? Now, the issue is this. When we move from there, and we're talking about blind spots tonight, to now getting to where we are with George Floyd, with Ahmaud Arbery, with Breonna Taylor, with, I can keep going, Trayvon Martin, Eric Gardner, I can be just, this is like Medgar Evers all over again for many of us. So I want you to just take a minute, and we've only got maybe about 20 more minutes left. And for those of you who are watching us tonight, if you want to ask questions, put them in the comment section. right there. We've got someone monitoring and watching those, and both Greg and I will respond to those and we'll answer those tonight. So we'd be happy to do so. But take me into this conversation I want to share with our listening audience that you and I had. You said, you know, Ray, white privilege looks like this. And some of your stories.
And I think when I look at what you just talked about with these the bishop or these pastors and these people that took the position that they could justify through the Bible, the lens of the Bible, the lens of Christianity, that slavery was right. 99 point some percent of Caucasians today can look back at that and say that's wrong. The problem is they believe that nothing is carried forward, that they feel like this problems have been solved. And that's the difference in me and many other Caucasians that are actually rallying to the support to end racism, to bring equality, to bring equal justice, etc. It's just a lack of a realization that it still exists. Nobody really would look back and say, oh, that was okay, it should have continued. So white privilege. So, and I'm going to give you my personal example. Well, first off, in terms of white privilege, when I say the word white privilege, and when African Americans say the term white privilege, it makes a lot of white people mad.
Yeah,
there are plenty of white people that understand white privilege and that have gained an understanding of white privilege. And there are many different definitions of what white privilege is. Here's what I have learned that white privilege is. White privilege is not that somebody gave you your education, somebody gave you your job, somebody gave you your success. White people that are successful, for the most part, have worked for that success. There are many, many examples of people that inherited wealth and blew it. They became drug addicts. They became ne'er-do-wells. They became lazy. And there's a lot of conversation, a lot of studies about how the third or the fourth generation of wealth become, fall into poverty because of lack of really applying themselves and an entitlement mindset. And, maybe the people didn't learn to tie their shoes, that kind of thing. And so, it can happen. So white privilege doesn't mean that if you're white, you're going to have a good job. You're going to have good health. You're going to have plenty of money. You're going to be respected. It doesn't mean that. What white privilege is, what I've learned is white privilege is what you do not get. In other words, as a white person, I get an assumption of innocence. I get an assumption of education. People assume that I'm educated. I'm in a group called 200 plus men are two white guys and 130, 40, 50 African Americans.
Right.
I'm in the lowest tier, the lowest percentage of education. I might be in the bottom 5%. I'm confident I'm in the bottom 10% because I have 1 year of college.
Right.
And these guys are incredible men here in Hampton Roads. And there's no chance that I'm above the bottom 10 percentile on education. But if you get us a lineup of 150 of us and you ask people who's the most educated in that, I guarantee you I wouldn't be picked in the bottom 10%. There's no way in the world. And so there's an assumption of education. There's an assumption of competency. There's an assumption of intellect. There's an assumption of innocence. These assumptions that I receive that I've never gotten in an elevator and somebody clutched their purse, right? I've never walked in a store and had people kind of follow me around, even though when I was a kid, I shoplifted like crazy. I got caught the first time shoplifting at 6 years old. I started the year before when I was 5.
Not Gregg Garret.
No, I got caught the first time when I was 6 years old shoplifting, and I continued shoplifting after that, right? My first arrest was at 11 years old.
Right.
And from 11 years old, my first crime I got caught doing was at 6, again, shoplifting. But the first time I got arrested was 11 years old. And from 11 years old until 19 years old, I was arrested at least 6 times. I'm not sure exactly how many, but it is
not Gregg Garret. No,
this Gregg Garret. At least 6 times I was arrested. Now here's the interesting facts about my arrest.
Go ahead.
I went to jail at each arrest, went before the magistrate and went either before the magistrate and got released or went before the magistrate and went into lockup. I never ate breakfast in jail. I was out before breakfast was served. Now I was getting in trouble at midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, whatever stupid stuff I was doing or evil, bad stuff I was doing. I never had breakfast in jail. I wasn't in there 2 years. 2 days, 3 days, 2 weeks. No, I never had breakfast in jail, never once. At 15 years old, right at that midpoint between my criminal time of 11 to 19. At 15 years old, I was in court for multiple counts of grand larceny, multiple felonies, 5 felonies. I'd committed 20, 30, I don't know how many I'd committed, breaking into cars, stealing 8-track tape players. And we did it with a hammer. We just smashed the window, and we didn't, try to figure out a way to get in the car. We just smashed the window. We didn't care if it was raining at night. We were, and we would steal rip the dashboard out, take a crowbar and rip the dashboard off. We didn't care. We just wanted the 8-track tape players. We were selling them for $50 and whatever we got for them, $25. And so I was in court for multiple counts of grand larceny. Well, guess who the judge was? The judge lived 8 streets down in our white neighborhood. You think the judge was white? Of course. He was a friend of my father's. My father was a member of the yacht club and the country club. He was a friend of my father's. He was a member of the German club, which was like a dance cotillion club. And he was a friend. And I went before him. He had his black robe on. And I got, said, okay, don't get in trouble for a year and I'm going to drop the charges. At 19, I was back. I got arrested several times in between then. But at 19, the most serious thing that I did, I was in court. I was arrested for and went to court for assault on a police officer. So got caught. My first crime, I got caught, I was 6. I was arrested the first time at 11, 6 times between 11 and 19, fights, drunk driving, grand larceny, assault on a police officer. Now, if you go down and do a criminal investigation on Gregg Garret, guess what you're going to find?
The record expunged.
Clean record, right? I'm talking about it because I'm willing to admit it. Clean record. And the reason it's a clean record is when I got in the real estate business at 19, or right after that assault on a police officer, when I got in the real estate business, one of my clients was an assistant Commonwealth attorney. What color do you think he was? White. Now, the current Commonwealth attorney in the city that I was raised in, which is Hampton, is a very dear friend of mine, and he happens to be African American. But at the time, it was a white Commonwealth attorney. It was a white assistant Commonwealth attorney, and he had my record expunged. So you're not going to find any of that. So it's what didn't I get? How I'm a whatever I am. I don't know what I am, but I mean, I get the impression I'm a respected businessman in the community. I'm kind of in some ways a community leader. I'm not saying that bragging, but I mean, there's a perception that I'm something better than just a derelict, something better than a robber. I'm something better than a guy that would assault a police officer. I'm something better than a guy that would vandalize buildings and drive drunk and terrorize the neighborhood and all the stuff that I did. I'm perceived as at least better than that. And how did that happen?
Mm-hmm.
How did I not get a felony against me? Why did I not go to Beaumont, which was the reform school, the detention center for juveniles? Why did that not happen? Why do I not have a record? And the question is, you can't answer that maybe, but the question is, would it have been different if I was black?
Absolutely.
At 11, at 15, for multiple counts of grand larceny, an assault on a police officer, would it have been different? Would my outcome have been different? Would my consequences would have been different? Or would I have gotten all the breaks that I got as a white man? I suspect I wouldn't have if my skin was your color, Ray. If you'd have done the same thing that I had done, I suspect that your outcome would have been much different than mine. Your consequences would have been much different than mine. And you would not necessarily be a prominent person in the community. Now, you wouldn't necessarily be because you would have not been able to have taken those steps at escalating, and as I did in my career. I've worked hard. Nobody gave me anything. I mean, not really, I don't want to say nobody gave me anything.
Right.
I mean, I've worked for what I have. God has blessed me. I've worked, I've tried, right? But what would I have lacked? What would have happened to me if I was African American? My guess, my trajectory would have been completely different. And I would have hit like a ceiling very, very young and would have been destined for something much different than what I've been able to experience as a white man.
Had you had been me and I had been you, 11, you said 6, 11, 15, and 19. By the time.
Bunch of times in between.
And a bunch of times in between. So from 15, I would have already been inside of the system. At 6, which is really, you're coming into the first grade. So we have something now by Marian Wright Alleman, who has written this piece called the Cradle to the Prison Pipeline by the third grade.
I've got multiple copies of it.
Yeah, they determine already, and they build the prisons based upon what your behavioral and academic response, mainly your behavioral detention, getting in trouble in the classroom. They build the prisons and privatize them based upon that by the time you're in the third grade. So by 15, I'm already in the system.
Right.
I already am headed toward having a felony on my record. There is no expungement. Because I got a felony, then I don't get access to college funding. I don't get access to federal loans. I don't get access to a job, because you know what that does to Black men when they have a felony on their record. Nobody trusts them. Nobody would hire them. I don't get the opportunity to become Greg Garret. This is what white privilege does. It's what it keeps you from having the opportunity to have. But then at the same time, you have the benefit of the doubt of being innocent, the benefit of the doubt of being intelligent, the benefit of the doubt of being respectable, the benefit of the doubt of having access to an opportunity, being an upstanding individual. And during those years, you're admittedly saying you were committing these kinds of things that were happening.
Right.
But look at you today. So you wouldn't have had access to a providential life if you were Black. And this is what white privilege seems to produce. And I'm hoping that our listening audience tonight is getting a glimpse of that, because Eric Gardner loses his life because he's selling CDs outside of the store. Ahmaud Arbery is jogging. Breonna Taylor sitting in her house. Philando Castile sitting, if you remember the video, sitting in his car with his fiance and the baby girl in the back, and got his hands up on the dash and still is shot. There is no presumption of innocence. There is no presumptions of being upstanding when you're African American. And I'm hoping tonight that those who are watching us are now understanding this as you're saying this and communicating this to us as a white man, successful businessman, entrepreneur of the year several times in Hampton Roads, and really providing an extra quality of life. I remember, here's the difference. So when I'm growing up here in the city of Hampton, when we moved from the area of Phoebus over into the area of Todd Mill, I'm 15, I'm turning 16, I get my driver's license. And so the duality of what I've had to deal with looks like this. When my dad would let me use his car, and he would say, okay, you and the guys on the basketball team, I tell you what, this is a nice car. I don't want you to drive downtown. Because, during that time, you and I know best ball was played at 6th and Ivy, right at Doris Miller Community Center, over in areas in Phoebus. Best ball played in those urban areas. So I'm going where the best ball is played at. Right. And all of a sudden he says, I don't want you to drive in those areas with the car, because someone may become jealous of you and then rob and take the car from you. In the same token, he would say, you and your friends, don't you go past this area of Mercury Boulevard and Andrews Boulevard. Don't you go into this neighborhood, and don't you dare not cross this area or this bridge and go in that neighborhood, because they're going to stop you and ask you, what are you doing in this car? And this is your dad's car. And so we've had to have the conversation with our children, hands on the dashboard. Yes, sir. No, sir, officer. No sudden movements, making sure you're rehearsing what it is that you're doing when you're reaching into your glove compartment to get things out. White privilege, most white kids don't have to do that, even yet still today. So we're just having the conversation tonight. What do you think, from your estimation, Greg, beyond, we can talk public policy and all that kind of stuff, and maybe in another conversation, and this is probably a good moment to say this could be a series of talks between us to help our community understand. But as we wrap up tonight, because I don't necessarily see any questions that have come in quite yet, what would you say could be a step toward the solution of solving the issue of race?
Well, first off, trying to understand each other, trying to develop relationships of understanding. If I want to challenge any Caucasians listening to this, and many Caucasians are incredibly taking proactive stands against racism. There's all kinds of wonderful things that are happening in the white community. I mean, it's might be unprecedented as far as how much whites are standing with our brothers and sisters of color and saying it's time to stamp this out. It's time to deal with this once and for all. But here's what I'd like to challenge people that are not already doing something like this. Number one, find people in your neighborhood, in your church, in your community, at your workplace. Find people of color and ask them to tell you their stories of racism. I believe that every African American in America, I believe that everyone, if you really will ask them, say, please, please, I really want to know, please tell me when you have experienced racism. I believe that every African American will be able to tell you, and probably off the top of their head, but you gotta, they may be uncomfortable telling you that. They may be uncomfortable because you'll look at them differently. But if you'll develop a relationship that's close enough for them to feel safe in telling you, you'll be able to start to hear the stories of things that will surprise you. Secondly, challenge yourself. Challenge yourself, because every African American, I believe, knows when they have experienced racism. I do not believe that every white person, or even anywhere close to every white person, and maybe not even half of Caucasians, know when they've experienced white privilege. And it's why it's so offensive when I use the word white privilege, or when people use the word white privilege, people get really fired up. They get absolutely fired up when that word is used. And so I believe there's a lack of understanding among Caucasians of when they have experienced white privilege. I can tell you there's an African American civic leader that's been a friend of mine. He's maybe 15 years older than I am, that referred somebody to me, a very important person to me in another city, about maybe 15 years ago. To this day, that referral was the largest commission I have ever made in my 43-year real estate practice.
Wow.
An African American community leader referred me to a community leader of another city.
Mm.
That city was 80% white. If I was his black fraternity brother, if I was his brother-in-law, if I was his best friend, could he have referred me to this Caucasian leader in an 80% Caucasian community to work for this Caucasian government to do a real estate transaction that required an unbelievable amount of trust for me to do this thing? And it's a very intricate thing that I actually bought something on behalf of a municipality.
Mm-hmm.
I was a white guy dealing with white city council members, a white city manager buying a piece of property from a white church anonymously without telling them why I was buying it.
Mm-hmm.
Unbelievable trust that they had to trust me.
Yeah.
If I happened to have been black, would my African American friend, this incredibly prominent, respected man, would he have referred me, and would that have worked out? My biggest commission I've ever made. Dozens of times bigger than an average commission. Not twice as big or 3 times as big or 10 times as big. Dozens of times as large as an average commission. It's just, that's something I thought about today when I was thinking about, white privilege and examples. I hadn't thought about that for a while. I didn't really I've never thought of that as white privilege. I've never thought about that as white privilege.
Yeah.
Right. And so so I challenge Caucasians to say, when have I experienced something that I would not have experienced I would not have had the same positive outcome. I wouldn't have been able to have avoided the consequences, or I wouldn't have been able to receive the benefit if I had been African American. And one of the ways you're going to understand that is when you hear the stories of what our African American brothers and sisters have experienced. My dentist is a very dear friend of mine, and he happens to be African American.
Mm-hmm.
When he pulled up in a Prius station wagon, now this guy lives in a Miami Vice house that I sold him. I'm talking about laid out Mac Daddy. It's a beautiful, it's got more outside covered porches than most houses have square footage inside, right? Yeah. It's tile roof. It's just 3-car garage. When he pulled up, I don't even know what we were doing, but we were going somewhere or doing something, and he pulled up in a Prius station wagon instead of his Mercedes SUV, the largest Mercedes SUV that they made at the time, is what I saw in the prior time. when he pulled up in that. And I said, what's that, a rental car, man? What are you doing driving that? Now, I'm not fancy in my cars, but I mean, this guy, you know, he drives a Mercedes SUV, that's fine. And he pulls up in a Prius station wagon. And so I started ribbing him. I mean, we're close enough. I can rib him about anything. I rib him about his bald head. I rib him, I can rib him about anything, right? We're dear friends.
Yeah.
And but the second or third time I was riding him about that Prius station wagon, he said, okay, I'm going to tell you. I got rid of the Benz because I was tired of the cops stopping me. And I was driving a Prius, especially a Prius station wagon. They would leave me alone. This isn't our community. This isn't Hampton Roads. This is not during slavery times. This is not 1965. Okay, I'm not talking about 1965. I'm talking about 2018, 2019. Okay,
so he changed his car.
He changed his car to a Prius. I got nothing wrong with driving a Prius station wagon. Prius station wagon is nice, but that's not what he wants to drive. He can afford to drive a Mercedes SUV, right? And so fast forward 2 weeks ago. And I'm sitting, I'm talking in my phone, doing a text message, while I'm driving. I'm sorry, I'm guilty again. I'm still a bad guy, I guess. I speak a long text message into my phone. But when you speak it into your phone, it's messed up. And you got to change a few words, and it doesn't do right. You got to edit it. So instead of edit it while I'm driving, I was a good boy. It was late at night. I pulled into a automobile dealership, and sometimes how the cars are blocking the entrance to the car dealerships. This wasn't blocked; it was lit up, and so I pulled in there, just parked in the middle between all the lights, and I'm fixing the text message. I get that one fixed, and I see a couple other text messages I need to respond to. It's like 11 o'clock at night, and all of a sudden I get a tap 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 on my window. Tap 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 on my window, and I look back, and it's a police officer, and he's not alarmed. Doesn't seem to be, worried. He doesn't have his hand on his gun. I mean, it just, I roll down the window and he starts talking to me. He says, sir, the security cameras come on when a car comes in, and, they just, want to make sure that everything's okay. He wasn't suspicious I was there to steal wheels. He wasn't there to think I was going to steal batteries out of cars. He wasn't, I'm a 62-year-old white man. He wasn't worried about what I was going to do there. And almost immediately I interrupted him with no sense of any concern whatsoever and said, oh, by the way, I got a 9mm right beside me that's loaded. He didn't flinch. He didn't say, get out of the car. He didn't say, put your hands on the dashboard. He didn't say, you got a what? He didn't even blink. When I said, oh, by the way, I got a 9mm right beside me that's loaded. Mm-hmm. His voice didn't change. He didn't flinch. I just don't think that would have been the same outcome if I was a 25-year-old African-American male.
Absolutely not.
I think the flinch, I think something would have been different in that encounter. Now, maybe, I mean, there are plenty of police officers that would have handled that the right way if I was a 25-year-old African-American male. I don't doubt that. I have police officer friends that are the most honorable, amazing people, white people and African-American, but I have Caucasian police officer friends that I don't think would do anything to an African-American 25-year-old male that they shouldn't do. But I just don't think the average, I don't think that, I think there are many situations, let me say it this way, I think there are many situations that if I'd have been a 25-year-old African-American male or a 35-year-old African-American male, that that could have been a different scenario. And I don't mean they would have dragged him out of the car. I don't know what they would have done. But I'm just telling you, in my situation, there was no flinching, no concern whatsoever.
I would dare say, I would agree with you, but I would say the percentage of some kind of an altercation happening, especially when you said, I've got a loaded 9mm right here in the car, immediately put your hands on the dash, and then followed up with, let me see your license and registration. And what you didn't say was he just tapped on the window and said, hey, what are you doing? Or anything like that. Right. But had it been an African-American, if he was 50, 60, 70, 45, 25, 30, let me see your license and registration. What are you doing in this parking lot right now?
Again, I don't know what would have happened, but I mean, I was never concerned. I was never intimidated. And you compare that to some of the things that we've seen in some of the things that we've seen, like George Floyd. I mean, if I can tell you this, if I passed a $20 bill that was counterfeit as the day is long,
Right.
I went in a convenience store and passed a $20 bill. There's no chance a cop would have had his knee on my neck an hour later or 30 minutes later. There was no chance I would have been suffocated. There's probably no chance that somebody would have even thought that I knew it was a counterfeit.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that if I passed, I believe I could probably pass $120 bills over the next year in 100 different stores.
Right.
Or find out that they're counterfeit. And unless they can tie it to a pattern of me passing counterfeit bills, if they were individual situations, I bet you 100 out of 100 times, I would be assumed that I picked up that $20 bill as change out of a register somewhere, and nobody would even look at me and think, "Oh, wait a minute, Garrett, you got a scam going on here." Again, the second or third or fourth time, they would think I got a scam going. Right? But I don't believe there's any chance they would think that if I passed a $20 bill that it was intentional. I don't believe there's any chance I would have ended up getting arrested. There's certainly no chance somebody would have had their foot on my neck with my face against the street. And there's absolutely no chance I would have died. And see, that's white privilege. And so when you think about George Floyd's background, when I hear people think about, oh, George Floyd did this, George Floyd did that. Yes, George Floyd did terrible things, awful things in the past. Yes, so has Gregg Garret. Okay, so has Gregg Garret. Me and a bunch of buddies of mine in Virginia Beach one night were got in a fight with a bunch of Navy guys. I absolutely respect the Navy. I'm embarrassed to say this. We got in a fight with a bunch of Navy guys because one of them said something smart aleck to a girlfriend of mine, and that was good enough reason to fight him. The end of the fight, one of the Navy guys had the bottom of his ear bitten off.
My God.
Right? I didn't do it. I didn't bite his ear off, but one of my buddies did. Right? Yeah. I mean, we've done terrible. I mean, I could just go on and on and on with stuff we've done. So me passing a $20 bill, nothing would happen.
Right.
Other guy done stuff wrong. I've done stuff wrong. Let's
wrap up with this tonight, Greg, so I don't keep you too long. You know, many of us as pastors or spiritual leaders in Virginia, we really believe that, I'm going to use this term and then maybe we can unpack it at another time. I'll just use it tonight. That Virginia, particularly Hampton Roads, represents the Eastern Gateway. And we believe that there's going to be a move of God in our area. Both of us are Christians. We love the Lord, and the Lord Jesus Christ is our personal Lord and Savior. Amen. And we're devout Christians and that sort of thing. But how important is Virginia in this, in terms of this kind of discussion, from your vantage point, in terms of how you see it? How important is Virginia to be a part of the catalyst of change of leading the nation where racism is?
I think we've got the responsibility to be the tip of the spear against racism. I think we have the responsibility to take the opportunity that we have. You see, we have a very healthy mix of blacks and whites. Mm-hmm. We have mixture in our workplaces. There's so many things that we've accomplished here. But if you go all the way back to history, in what we now call the United States of America, white control started on our shores in Eastern Virginia, not just in Virginia. White control started in Eastern Virginia, right here where we live. And African slavery started right here in Eastern Virginia. And so if white control started here in the United States, what ended up being the United States, if African slavery started here, what ended up being the United States, then it needs to stop here. And we need to get together as brothers and sisters. We need to get over our differences. And I believe that we need to speak to people that look like us more than we do. And just like Joe Drury did to me when I was 12 years old on our way to sailing lessons, when I used the N-word, and he turned around in the car, stopped his car on Spotswood Place and turned around and said, "I don't ever want to hear you say that word again," when I said the N-word. This is a white man that confronted me. How dare him confront me for that, to a word that I used all the time. That's what I thought at the time. And I look back now with utter respect, complete respect for Joe Drury. I've told this story 50 or 100 times about this man, Joe Drury, that still lives here in Hampton Roads today. Yeah. That's what we need to do. We need to confront people that look like us, and we need to love people that don't look like us. And we need to do everything we can to try to understand their plight And that's our responsibility. If we do that here in 757, if we do that here in Eastern Virginia, we will be the beginning of solving racism and exporting it to the rest of our country.
My God. Well, there you have it. You heard it live from, I would call the son of the Confederacy here in Virginia that has had a troubled history, but to look at him today. Greg, thank you so much for being on this call tonight and to being bold enough to make the statements that you have made. This is how it's going to start. This is how it's going to begin. Your missions work all throughout the South America and different places where you go and serve and do houses and irrigation systems, and then to involved in teaching the word, to your work here locally with urban young men and helping them get a sense of who they are is the kind of model work that everyone should be doing. Maybe this can turn into a series of conversations where we kind of go bit by bit, piece by piece. What does the business community have to do? What should the church be doing? What should be taking place in education? How can government be a part of this so that we get something that's got some teeth in it, so that those who represent us and lead us in our region can take something to the General Assembly that can become a model. If the House of Burgess can become the model from which Congress is developed, that we know today as the Virginia House of Delegates, why can't, as you mentioned, stopping the seedbed of slavery and the overflow of that take place and stop here tonight? I want to thank you for joining in and tuning in. Those of you who are watching, make sure you share this and send it with a friend. This is just the start of something. Greg, for people that want to get in touch with you, as if you can't go online and find Greg Garret Realty, just give them some information of where they can contact you, your missions work, if they want to be a part of serving some of the things that you do.
Well, Orphan Helpers is an organization that we started 20 years ago, and that's the one you referred to, is working down in Central America. We work in El Salvador, Honduras, and moving into Guatemala. We were going to move into Guatemala this year. It's probably not going to be until next year with the COVID-19 and everything that's going on. But that's just www.orphanhelpers.org. The real estate company, we're bringing in the next generation of leadership, and the next generation of leadership is the reason that I have taken the first name out of the company. That we're opening up equity positions for the next generation, and so the company now is no longer Gregg Garret Realty. It's the same company, but it's now called Garret Realty Partners because of the partnership opportunities and the equity opportunities for the next generation, and people that are willing to work hard, be loyal, perform and lead and sacrifice. And so that's, Garret Realty Partners is easy to find me, or just find me on Facebook, is where I post a lot, and I post positions that make some people mad sometimes, but at the same time, I think that I'm doing what God has called me to do in the areas of racial reconciliation and working for real, true, equal justice and equal opportunity here in at least in the Hampton Roads area.
Well, there you have it. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Share this when you see it. This is the start of how we're going to begin to bring change in America, and bring change from right out of Eastern Virginia, from the Eastern Gate, where the Spirit of God can move in our area. Greg, thank you so much for being with me tonight. We'll get together again and do this. And Juneteenth celebrations are coming up, and I'm sure there are going to be a lot of things that will be happening, taking place. And we'll reach back out again to our audience. We know this one was quick, but we'll give more lead time for the next ones and a couple of ones that will follow after this. And thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. God bless you and good night. Bye-bye.